When you think of Egypt today, Arabic inevitably comes to mind. But for most of its history, Arabic played no role in the linguistic life of the country. Unsurprisingly, the original language of Egypt is Egyptian. According to modern linguistics, it belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, which also includes Berber, Semitic, or Cushitic languages. With a written history spanning over 4,000 years, Egyptian holds the record for the longest continuously attested human language. Still, its earliest phase, before writing, remains a mystery. By around 4000 BCE, many Neolithic cultures along the Nile were likely speaking early dialects of Egyptian, probably already distinct from their Afro-Asiatic cousins. And just like in West and East Asia, the Neolithic revolution in Egypt laid the groundwork for statehood, organized religion, and writing. With the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and the rise of the First Dynasty around 3100 BCE, the first hieroglyphs emerged. Earlier versions did exist, but they were closer to proto-writing. At that stage, known as Archaic Egyptian, writing wasn't meant to represent ordinary speech, but served exclusively for ceremonial purposes. This early phase lasted until the Old Kingdom, also known as the Age of the Pyramids. At that time, hieroglyphs became more standardized and phonetic, and wouldn't witness much change for over 2,000 years. A new cursive script, hieratic, also appeared. It was better suited to papyrus and the expanding needs of bureaucracy and literature. Interestingly, despite this growing literary sophistication, Egypt remained linguistically isolated. Its natural borders, the desert, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, may have shielded it from most external influences. That isolation continued well into the Middle Kingdom, often seen as Egypt's golden age of literature and culture, and most certainly its best documented one. The language of this era, Middle Egyptian, became the classical standard. It was used in stories, in funerary texts, and temple inscriptions. Even centuries after it was no longer spoken, it remained the prestige written form. But surprisingly, despite Egypt's numerous military campaigns of that period, through which it established dominance over Canaan, Nubia, and parts of Syria, regions where Semitic languages were spoken, it seems that its own language stayed remarkably stable in grammar and vocabulary. You could say that, linguistically, Egypt was still speaking to itself. But this was about to change. Egypt's linguistic isolation began to break during the Second Intermediate Period, when the Hyksos, likely a Semitic-speaking people long established in the Nile Delta as traders and mercenaries, took control of Lower Egypt. Their rule was short-lived, but it left a lasting mark. They introduced new vocabulary, military practices, and administrative techniques, especially in trade and warfare. After they were expelled by Theban rulers who managed to regain control over their land, Egypt entered the New Kingdom. This was the country's imperial peak and its greatest territorial expansion. It brought prolonged contact with Semitic and Nubian languages, while spoken Egyptian began diverging from the conservative written form that had prevailed so far. A new linguistic phase, Late Egyptian, emerged. It was still written in hieratic, but now reflected natural and profound shifts in grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, and structure. And unlike Middle Egyptian, the written records of that era appear to reflect a language closer to how people actually spoke. However, this golden age was soon to come to an end. The state, strained by the cost of empire and weakened by internal divisions, eventually lost its grip on power and territory. By the time of the Third Intermediate and Late Periods, Egypt had ceased to be a hegemonic force. It was now ruled by a succession of foreign dynasties: the Libyans, the Nubians, the Assyrians, and the Persians. Each brought their own culture and linguistic influence, but only the Persian Achaemenid Empire imposed an actual foreign language in the administration. Under Achaemenid rule, Aramaic was introduced. It was the administrative lingua franca of the empire, and for the first time, Egyptian speakers had to operate under a governance system that didn't use their native language. Unsurprisingly, Aramaic left a significant influence on Egyptian, at least in its written form. Loanwords, syntax, and even spelling. By this point, the local language had entered a new phase known as Demotic. This phase of the language was marked by the development of another writing system, the Demotic script, which emerged around 650 BCE and was directly derived from the form of hieratic used in the northern part of the country. It was faster, more compact, and better suited for the practical needs of daily life. It soon became the main script for administration and everyday writing. Meanwhile, hieroglyphs and traditional hieratic were increasingly confined to temple rituals and religious texts. The Achaemenid conquest thus introduced a decisive change. The Egyptian language lost its exclusive role as the language of power. From then on, Egypt would continue to witness the lasting linguistic impact of waves of new rulers. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great swept into Egypt. By then, heavy taxes, religious interference, and the marginalization of native elites had made the Achaemenid rulers particularly unpopular with the population. So when Alexander arrived, many Egyptians didn't see him as a conqueror. They seemingly welcomed him as a liberator. With him began Egypt's long Hellenistic era. Alexander founded Alexandria as a new Greek-speaking city that would soon surpass Athens itself as the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world. After his death in 323 BCE, his generals divided the empire. Egypt went to Ptolemy, one of his closest companions. In 305 BCE, he declared himself pharaoh, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty, the country's last royal house and its longest. The Ptolemies were Macedonian, but they knew they had to blend traditions to maintain control and gain the sympathy of the local population. Strategically, they adopted Egyptian religious rituals and presented themselves as pharaohs, while retaining a strong Greek identity. Naturally, Greek became the dominant language of administration, the military, and commerce, and ended up heavily influencing Demotic Egyptian, which was already influenced by Aramaic, at least in its written form. For a time, Demotic continued as the script for everyday use, but hieroglyphs and hieratic were now mostly confined to temples. Religion became the final stronghold of the traditional language and the exclusive domain of Egyptian priests. Interestingly, Greek presence in Egypt didn't begin with Alexander. As far back as the 7th century BCE, Greek merchants had established Naucratis, a city in the Nile Delta, with the blessing of the pharaohs, who were there struggling with multiple invaders. Over time, Greeks became mercenaries, advisors, and landowners, even under foreign rulers like the Persians. By the time Alexandria was founded, Greek influence was already well-rooted in the country. But this cultural exchange was far from equal. Egyptian society became sharply stratified. A Greek elite controlled politics, the economy, and the military. Most native Egyptians naturally were excluded from power. Some Egyptians adopted Greek names and customs to move upward, especially in cities, but for most, bilingualism was limited to elite circles. Greek became a marker of class, not just a language but a status. Meanwhile, rural Egyptians, making up the majority of the population, held on to their language and traditions. Though Egypt thrived under the early Ptolemies thanks to fertile lands and trade routes, this stability was short-lived. By the mid-2nd century BCE, dynastic infighting and foreign wars, especially the costly Syrian wars with the Seleucids, began to drain the kingdom, and as the Ptolemies weakened, they leaned ever more heavily on Rome. Though still technically independent, Egypt now orbited Rome, which dominated the Mediterranean, and soon enough, its fate would no longer be its own. Egypt's independence finally ended in 30 BCE. The efforts of Cleopatra VII to restore Egypt's sovereignty were defeated by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, and the country was annexed into the Roman Empire. But unlike other provinces, it wasn't just added to the map. As the empire's breadbasket and home to Alexandria, the second largest city, Egypt received close imperial attention. Culturally and linguistically, Egypt remained deeply Hellenized. By the 1st century BCE, Greek had replaced Demotic in law, commerce, and elite correspondence. Latin, the official language of Rome, did appear in some contexts, like the military, but it never displaced Greek. It didn't need to. Greek had already been entrenched for centuries, shaping urban Egypt's schools, courts, and bureaucracies under the Ptolemies. As for Egyptian, it was still the native language of the population, especially in rural areas, and recorded in the Demotic script. However, its official role had been reduced. While it was once the language of commerce and administration, it was now confined to temples and religious texts, a significant shift from its earlier role. Over time, and under the increasing influence of Greek, Egyptian evolved into its final form, Coptic. This transformation was already clear in the 2nd century. This final stage of the language is remarkable in many ways, one of which being the development of a unique script. As knowledge of the Demotic script was waning, Egyptians started to increasingly rely on Greek to write down anything. This led them to a practical decision, adopting the Greek script to transcribe their own language. Not only was the alphabet familiar, but it was also capable of showing vowels for the first time in Egyptian writing. They simply added a few demotic signs for uniquely Egyptian sounds, and a new script was born. Although today Coptic is often used to refer to the Egyptian Christian population, at first the word wasn't related to Christianity at all. Interestingly, one of the earliest uses of what would become the Coptic script appears in magical texts. In ancient Egyptian belief, the spoken word held magical power, and pronunciation was critical to ritual success. This need to vocalize Egyptian words made the Greek script, with its vowels, an attractive tool. But the word Coptic itself comes from the Arabic word Copt, which came from the Greek word Aegyptos, meaning Egyptian. In other words, Coptic didn't start as a Christian term. It simply meant the language of the Egyptians. But when Christianity spread in the 3rd and 4th centuries, Coptic found a new role. It became the language of sermons and scriptures, especially in Upper Egypt where monasteries flourished. When the Roman Empire officially split in 395, Egypt became part of the Byzantine Empire. Under Byzantine rule, Egypt continued to uphold Greek traditions, particularly in urban centers. Religion had grown into a central aspect of cultural life, and the Coptic clergy began to play an increasingly prominent public role. The Coptic language gained importance, especially in religious settings, to the point where bilingual texts in Greek and Coptic became widespread. During this period, the church also emerged as a major landowner and a powerful social institution. But beneath the surface of prosperity, tensions were growing. In 451, the Council of Chalcedon attempted to unify Christian doctrine across the empire. It declared that Christ had two natures, divine and human, united in one person. But the Coptic Church rejected this definition, rather believing Christ had a single unified nature. The Byzantine state responded with force to this heresy. Greek-speaking bishops were installed by imperial order, native clergy were removed, exiled, or imprisoned. Coptic churches were confiscated, handed over to the state-backed Chalcedonian Church. Combined with heavy taxation and political exclusion, this persecution alienated much of the Egyptian population, and it is in this context that Islam and Arabic arrived in the country in 642. Before we look at how Egypt became Arab in language and culture, we need to pause and ask, what does Arabization actually mean? Arabization does not imply a population was replaced or physically relocated. Instead, it refers to a gradual shift in language and identity. This cultural and linguistic process is often linked to the spread of Islam, but Islamization and Arabization are not synonymous. In fact, in Egypt, Arabic took hold faster than Islam. Even now, a significant portion of the population, roughly 10%, is still Christian. Brushing it off simply by saying, oh, they became Muslims, is too easy and requires a more nuanced explanation. Consider the linguistic landscape before the Arab conquests. Arabic's eventual dominance in this crowded space was far from inevitable. Interestingly, one of the most striking outcomes of the early Islamic conquests was a linguistic split that aligned closely with the old imperial borders. In former Byzantine lands, Arabic replaced Greek and Latin. In the former Sasanian Empire, Persian made a comeback. This might seem expected. Persian had deep roots, while Greek was mostly elite, but it's still surprising. Greek declined quickly outside elite and church circles, even though Byzantium survived. One might have expected that Greek, backed by such a presence, would have endured, or at least resisted, the dominance of Arabic, and yet it faded, while Persian rebounded. Why? Some point to religion. Greek remained tied to Byzantine Christianity, while Persian was tolerated because the Persians themselves adopted Islam and heavily contributed to the development of Arabic and Islamic texts. But that doesn't fully explain it. The real question remains, why did Arabic, despite lacking classical prestige, succeed where other imperial languages failed? And why did people adopt it so widely, even when it wasn't imposed by force? The answer lies not in the language itself, but in the deeper identity shift that came with it. One key reason for Arabic's extraordinary spread was that it wasn't merely the language of rulers. Like Aramaic, Greek, and Latin before it, Arabic was initially used for official purposes, especially after Caliph Abd al-Malik declared it the official language of the empire in the late 7th century. But unlike those earlier imperial languages, Arabic did not remain confined to the elite. Instead, it gradually permeated all levels of society, becoming the dominant spoken and written language across vast urban territories. Arabic's expansion was partly driven by conversions to Islam. But unlike Islam, earlier religious shifts had not led to language loss. When Egyptians converted to Christianity, they continued speaking Coptic. So what changed? For the citizens of the empire, converting to Islam often meant more than a new faith. It meant adopting a new cultural identity. Even non-Arab converts came to see themselves as part of the Arab Islamic world. In this way, Islamization and Arabization became closely intertwined. As Islam spread, so did Arabic, reinforcing one another. The Islamic Empire created something that had not really existed before, a vast, interconnected area where one language linked regions from Spain to Central Asia. Arabic became the language of movement. If you wanted to travel, to study religious law, to join the imperial court, you needed Arabic. Naturally, as conversions to Islam increased, driven by faith, pragmatism, or opportunity, Arabic use also grew, especially in cities and trade hubs, to the point that even non-Muslims adopted it. Fluency in Arabic opened doors, socially, economically, politically, and as more people spoke it, its prestige and practicality only grew. Finally, and quite ironically, it was Greek knowledge that helped elevate Arabic. When the Abbasid dynasty established Baghdad in the 8th century, they turned it into the intellectual capital of the Islamic world. Greek texts were translated into Arabic, but Arabic did not just become a translation tool, it became the language of new thinking. By the 10th century, Arabic scholars weren't just translating, they were producing original work. Greek, meanwhile, faded. Even in its old strongholds, its knowledge had been absorbed and then surpassed by a new intellectual tradition. So why did Arabic succeed where Greek failed? Because Arabic became more than just the language of rulers. It was the language of faith, of learning, of law, of daily life. It offered not just power, but a place in a shared civilization, though this transformation unfolded unevenly, varying in time and space. This being said, how was Egypt, a civilization thousands of years old, Arabized? When the Arabs conquered Egypt in 642, they did not immediately transform its linguistic landscape. For decades after the conquest, Greek remained the language of administration, while Coptic was still dominant in the countryside, in churches, and in everyday speech. This was largely due to the fact that the new rulers first had to make a conscious decision to establish an Arab-Muslim state, one that was not merely a continuation or a copy of the Byzantine Empire. This began to change under the Umayyad Caliphate. In 686, Arabic was declared the official language of the empire. Even so, it wasn't until 705 that Arabic formally replaced Greek and Coptic in Egypt's administration. Now, what happened with Coptic? You might expect that after the Arab conquest, Coptic would begin to decline, but in the 1st century of Arab rule, it actually flourished. During the 1st century after the conquest, the Coptic Church actually benefited from the new Arab presence. The early Arab Muslim state maintained only a modest footprint in Egypt, mostly in the provincial capital of Fustat, which would later become Cairo. Rather than build an entirely new administration, it relied heavily on Byzantine structures already in place. This meant that Coptic elites remained central to governance. They managed taxes, local affairs, and much of the bureaucracy. Compared to the oppression under Byzantine rule, Arab governance brought a kind of unexpected relief. The Coptic community regained and even expanded its churches. This period of relative calm and cultural space gave rise to a flourishing Coptic literature. Some of the most significant texts in the history of that language were produced during this time. But by the 9th century, that momentum began to wane. Arabic was now the official language of the state, and naturally, Arabic speakers started to play a much more important role in cities. Similarly, the empire had begun to consolidate an Arab-Islamic identity. Conversions to Islam increased, driven not by persecution, but by practical incentives. Access to public office, lower taxes, legal advantages, and smoother integration into the state. These new bilingual converts often gradually shifted from Coptic to Arabic. Some even claimed Arab ancestry, hoping to raise their social prestige, just as many elites in the Maghreb did. But these weren't just individuals adapting to survive. It was these Egyptian converts who played a central role in shaping a new Egyptian identity within the Arab Islamic world. Writing in Arabic, they reframed their cultural heritage as Arab and Islamic. This allowed Egypt to become part of a broader civilizational narrative through its role in Islamic texts. After all, figures like Abraham, Joseph, or Moses all had ties to Egypt, and their presence in the Quran allowed Egyptian Muslims to see their land not as marginal, but as central to sacred history. Even Christian Egyptians could find resonance in this reinterpretation. But what explains the sharp rise in conversions around the 9th century? Early on, under the Umayyads and early Abbasids, the shift to Arabic was mostly pragmatic rather than ideological. Somehow, Copts still held cultural and administrative autonomy. Yet, as the bureaucracy transformed, the remaining part of public life, especially law, trade, or administration, began to require fluency in Arabic. For many Copts, adapting linguistically wasn't a choice but a necessity. However, this shift was soon reinforced by increasing legal and social restrictions. Especially with the reign of al-Mutawakkil, non-Muslims faced growing limitations on clothing, public religious expression, or access to certain professions. These policies didn't force conversion, but they pushed many Copts to the margins of civic and economic life. For younger generations, adopting Islam and Arabic was often the only path to opportunity, security, and social inclusion. Brief respite did come during the rule of the Ptolemies, a semi-autonomous dynasty of Turkic origin that governed Egypt with relative tolerance. Though loyal in name to the Abbasids, they were more pragmatic and adopted a softer stance towards non-Muslims, seemingly to prioritize local stability and efficient governance over strict religious enforcement. This allowed for some cultural continuity and reduced persecution. But even in this window of calm, Arabic remained the language of bureaucracy and advancement, and its use among Egyptians, including the Christians, continued to grow. This transformation was also precipitated by increased rural exodus. As Egyptians moved into cities, Arabic dominated public life. Coptic, increasingly irrelevant to Muslims and less practical beyond church contexts, began to recede. Regardless of religion, many Egyptians adopted Arabic to ensure their children could compete for government positions. Interestingly, this linguistic shift deepened under the Fatimids, a Shiite dynasty from Algeria that conquered Egypt in 969 and made Cairo the capital of its empire. Wary of Sunni opposition to their religious ideology, ironically, the Fatimids often favored Christian and Jewish scribes in administrative roles, considering them politically neutral and professionally reliable. This gave many Copts privileged access to bureaucratic positions, but only if they operated in Arabic. The incentive to shift linguistically became even stronger. During this time, Patriarch Abraham, then Pope of the Coptic Church, and very close to Caliph al-Mu'izz, made a significant move. He relocated the Patriarchate from Alexandria to Fustat, now called Cairo, presumably to align the church more closely with the Fatimid court. After all, Cairo was now the capital of an entire empire. However, this move was subsequently reversed by his successors. But despite this, many members of the clergy and part of the urban Christian community must have already been Arabized by then. We see this clearly in the writings of Severus ibn al-Muqaffa, a 10th century Coptic bishop. Lamenting that many Coptic Christians no longer knew their ancestral language, he composed major theological and historical works in Arabic, likely because he wasn't fluent in Coptic himself. Severus had also served as a katib, a secretary in the Fatimid administration. He wasn't just fluent in Arabic, he was immersed in its political and intellectual culture. And at the time, he must not have been the only Christian to have such a background. Despite this, it was only in the 11th century, under Cyril II, that the Church finally adopted Arabic as its language, and Cairo as its final residence. This wasn't just a change in address. It was a social and political move, aligning the center of Coptic authority closer to the heart of Islamic power. Under Cyril II, and even under his predecessor, Patriarch Christodoulos, many histories of the Church started being officially translated into Arabic, while original biographies were written directly into that language as well. Of course, this doesn't mean Coptic disappeared. In some rural strongholds, Coptic survived as a spoken language well into the 15th and 16th centuries, and even 19th century in some villages. But in cities, the shift accelerated. The end of the 11th century thus marked the beginning of Coptic's retreat from everyday speech to a more ritual and symbolic role. As we have seen, Islam and Arabic were not imposed by force. Rather, it was the cumulative weight of legal pressure, economic incentives, social mobility, and linguistic prestige that precipitated this shift. Over generations, these forces led to a profound realignment of both language and identity. The 705 decree to Arabize the bureaucracy may have marked the beginning, but the real transformation came from below. It is largely the Egyptians themselves, including the Christian Copts, who played a central role in spreading Arabic among the population. By the 10th century, Arabic had replaced both Greek and Coptic in the state. By the 11th century, Coptic legal documents had become rare. By the end of the 11th century, religious texts were also written in Arabic. Of course, this story wasn't all peaceful evolution. Under later rulers, especially the Ayyubids and the Mamluks, Egypt's Christians faced a far more hostile environment. The Mamluks, in particular, were fiercely devoted to Sunni Islamic orthodoxy. To them, Christians were dhimmis, protected, yes, but clearly subordinate. This led to a much stricter enforcement of the Dhimma Pact, this legal framework governing non-Muslim subjects. And between 1293 and 1354, a series of anti-Christian campaigns unfolded. Churches were destroyed, Christian clothing and behavior were regulated even more severely, public expressions of Christianity were heavily curtailed, and in this climate of persecution and marginalization, it is likely Arabic fluency became essential, not just for advancement, but for survival. Social norms profoundly affect language, and language affects our ability to see and represent the world, and the growing importance of Islam and Arabic in everyday life likely also shaped the lives of the Christians themselves. The sociolinguistic shift clearly appears in Kitab al-Idah, a theological guide written in Arabic around the 11th century. Its author remains unknown, but its purpose is clear, explaining Christian beliefs and liturgical practices to a community that could no longer fully understand Coptic. What is striking is that the book doesn't just highlight a language barrier, it also accuses the Coptic community of becoming spiritually confused. The everyday contact with Muslims, it claims, had made them resistant to core Christian doctrines. This statement thus suggests that Islamic theology and language had become so embedded in daily life that even Christian religious understanding was being reshaped by it. This growing tension between tradition and assimilation did not go unnoticed. The Apocalypse of Pseudo-Samuel of Kalamun, written sometimes between the 9th and 11th centuries, is a testimony to this shift. Likely composed by a monk from El Fayoum, The text was written in Coptic, yet ironically survives only in Arabic. The author attacks not only the urban clergy in Cairo for abandoning the Coptic language in pursuit of prestige and political favor, but also everyday Christians for adopting Arabic names, Islamic clothing, and Muslim ways of life. But how much of this reflects historical reality, and how much of it is apocalyptic exaggeration? It's hard to tell. This kind of literature, like many apocalyptic texts from the medieval period, is shaped by anxieties about identity loss and cultural survival. Whether literal or rhetorical, the warning is clear. Arabic had become dominant enough to provoke alarm. Despite everything, it is difficult to pinpoint exactly when Egyptian Christians embraced Arabic, especially when we distinguish between written and spoken language. Yes, by the end of the 10th century, legal and even an increasing number of ecclesiastical texts were mostly composed in Arabic. The urban elite had become largely Arabic-speaking. But what about the rest of the population? Essentially the peasantry, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population and lived outside elite culture. Dominance in official and cultural writing cannot possibly reflect an immediate uniform replacement of Coptic in daily life. In fact, the exact timeline and mechanism by which even Arabic literacy spread among Christians remains uncertain. Did Arabic gradually replace Coptic in church-run schools? Or did the two languages coexist for a time? We don't know yet. This remains one of the major open questions in the field. What we do know is that the adoption of Arabic was neither immediate nor universal. In major urban centers, reports suggest that Coptic comprehension was declining, even during church readings. But in the south and in rural areas, Coptic held on longer, especially in monastic communities. Resistance to Arabization remained strong in these settings, and Christian writings throughout the medieval period reflect this ongoing tension. Even as late as the 13th century, Arabic was not universally spoken among Christians. Some legal documents mention women who couldn't understand Arabic, suggesting that the transition may have been gendered as well as class-based. For example, Arabic contracts often included a clause noting that the terms had been read aloud first in Arabic, then in a foreign language, almost certainly Coptic. So even in formal settings, bilingualism continued. And the presence of Arabic didn't automatically mean the absence of Coptic, which, until now, continues to strive to survive, even if not as the native language of the Egyptians. As we have seen, Egypt was Arabized through a combination of factors. It was not just a conquest, it was not just decrees, it was a long and uneven process of change shaped by policy, power, adaptation, and belief. Throughout history, many peoples have seen profound and lasting changes in their cultural and linguistic identities. So Egypt, of course, isn't an exception, far from that. Still, I believe it is really interesting to come to understand how such shifts operate. I have learned a lot by making this video, and I hope you did too by watching it. Now, of course, condensing several millennia of linguistic history into a 30-minute video is not an easy exercise, and I appreciate that despite my efforts, it may well be that I made a lot of mistakes. So don't hesitate to point them out in the comments, hopefully in a respectful way, so that everybody can learn and grow. Now, it would also be really interesting to determine to what extent Coptic influenced Egyptian Arabic, but this will be for another video. Thank you for watching, and maybe see you next time. Bye-bye.